how to change a verb into an adjective in Swedish. In English, we usually do this when we want to express something in a passive voice. For example, when we say, the doors are closed. Now we actually created an adjective from the verb close. So if you think about the structure like the doors are beautiful, the doors are big, the doors are fine. So in those cases, beautiful, big, fine, they are adjectives. So actually the structure is the same when you say the doors are closed. So closed is the way to create the adjective-like part from a verb. And in this case, in grammar, we say you are creating a participle. So participle means you create something else from the verb. In Swedish, we have a similar grammar, and we call it Perfekt Particip, perfect participle. The perfect comes from the form we borrow from the verb, which is the perfect form or supinum form of Swedish. So the logic is the same, but the grammar rules are slightly more complicated. If you remember last time we talked about how we should conjugate adjectives in Swedish. We need to think about definiteness, singular and plural, and they should all be conjugated accordingly to the noun. And yes, you guessed right. When we use perfect particip, when we create a new noun from the verb, we should also think about those things. So today, let's explore further perfect particip. Perfect particip. So this is how you write perfect particip in Swedish, and you can translate it as perfect participles in English, but do bear in mind that perfect participles doesn't exist as a definition in English grammar. It only works in Swedish grammar. You will soon know why. Now, let's look into two examples to help us to understand this better. Vad är perfekt particip? What is perfect particip in Swedish? Första exemplet, the first example, huset är renoverat. The house is renovated. So in English, the house is renovated. Renovated is now a participle. And in English, the form renovated actually reminds you about the past tense of renovate, right? So you're actually using the past tense to create an adjective in English. So in English, actually, this is called past participle. So past participle in English is a way to create adjective from a verb. But if you see this structure in Swedish, huset är renoverat. Renoverat reminds you actually about the perfect form or supinum form of renovera. So you would say, jag har renoverat huset. I have renovated the house. So that's why we call perfect participle in Swedish, because we use different verb groups. We use different tenses of verbs to fill this function in Swedish. So the second example, jag är uppvuxen i Shanghai. I am upgrown in Shanghai. Så uppvuxen, om ni tänker på ordet växa, if you think about the word grow, växa, the perfect form of växa is vuxit, har vuxit. Så vuxen kommer från vuxit, supinum form. So it's also from the perfect form of the verb vuxit. Jag är uppvuxen, I'm upgrown in Shanghai. Otherwise, the structure reminds you the structure of using adjectives. So, huset är renoverat, the house is renovated. It's the same structure as huset är fint, the house is beautiful, for example. But in Swedish, there are more to think about. As being marked in the first example, you see huset, ett hus. Hus is an ett word, so you would use renoverat. You would use the T. So if it's an N word, for example, if you say skola, a school, a renovated school, the school is renovated. In Swedish, you would say skolan är renoverad. Skolan är renoverad. You would use D instead, D, because it's an N word. So you need to conjugate them as if they are adjectives in Swedish. So in this case, it's much easier in English, but more complicated in Swedish, and sometimes it makes you confused because the form of the verb reminds you about the tenses of the verb. But now we should bear in mind that they are not the verb tenses anymore. Now they are solely being used as adjectives. Because perfect particip is a way to create new adjectives from verb, so we should think about that they can exist in all situations as you use adjectives. So we talked about it earlier that we can use adjectives after certain verbs. For example, vara, bli, ser ut, känna sig och verka. Vara, to be, so is or are, är på svenska. Bli, become. Ser ut, looks. Känna sig, feels. Verka, seems. Till exempel, biljetterna är beställda. The tickets are ordered. Han verkar intresserad. He seems interested. Lägenheten ser sliten ut. The apartment looks torn. De kan också finnas innan ett substantiv. They can also exist before a noun, som bestämning as a definer. For example, en ostädad lägenhet, an uncleaned apartment. Den misstänkta mannen, the suspected man. Ett inställt seminarium, a cancelled seminar. Now, we've understood that perfect particip are used as adjectives. But how should we construct perfect particip? How should we construct those adjectives in Swedish? Perfekt particip bildas av stammen i supinum plus ändelse beroende på ordets artikel och singular eller pluralform. It is to say perfect particip in Swedish are constructed by the root in supinum form of the verb plus the endings according to the words article en or et, and if it's singular or plural form. So the first part explains where it comes from. The second part is about how you should conjugate them as if they are adjectives. Here we have an example. Till exempel, förvåna. Förvåna means shocked. Förvånat är supinum form. And when they are perfect particip, when they are changing to perfect particip, now they are not verb anymore, now they are used as adjectives, then they have three possible endings. Förvånad for en ord, so Jag är förvånad, till exempel I am shocked. Förvånad är för ett ord, till exempel barnet, the child, barnet är förvånat. Förvånade are for plural form, till exempel vi är förvånade, we are shocked. More examples. En förvånad person, ett förvånat barn, många förvånade människor, den där förvånade personen. So the ending D is for N word, T for ett word, de for plural, de is also for definite form. Den där förvånade personen, that shocked person. Okay, now we know how it works and how should we conjugate them as if they are adjectives. But how should we remember them? How should we learn them? So now let's go into this. Olika verbgrupper har olika ändelser. So according to different verb groups, they have different endings when you use perfect particip. So now we are talking about the verb groups we mentioned earlier when we learned verbs. Do you remember? We have 4 groups of verbs. The first 3 groups are regular ones and the 4th groups are irregular verbs. So according to different verb groups, the endings of the participle, perfect particip, can be a little bit different. Now let's look at this chart to see how it works with different groups of verbs. So let's look at the first group to start with. Grupp 1, tvätta, tvättar, tvättade, tvättat. So those are the tenses of the verb tvätta. So here we are still talking about the tenses of them as a verb. But when you create perfect particip, remember, now they are not verb anymore, they are adjectives. So for N word, you use tvättad, ett word, tvättat, plural, tvättade. Till exempel, en tvättad kjol, a washed dress, kjolen är tvättad. Ett tvättat linne, linnet är tvättat. Strumporna är tvättade. Här har vi plural. Here is the plural form. So, de for N word, te för ett word, de för plural. Bestämd form, den tvättade kjolen, the washed dress. Så tvättade, once again, tvättade, the same form is used both for plural and definite form. So it's the same logic as we use adjectives. For group 2A, it's a little bit different. Så till exempel vi har stänga, stänger, stängde, stängt. Now we borrow the root stäng and we create perfect particip, the adjective form. Stängde, stängt, or stängda. So you see in group 1 we have the for plural form. For group 2A we have da for the verb group. So en stängd dörr, a closed door. Ett stängt fönster, a closed window. Dörrarna är stängda, the doors are closed. Så stängda, plural form. Den stängda dörren, the closed door. So stängda is also for definite form. For 2B, for example, köpa, köper, köpte, köpt. Now we changed it in a different way. Till exempel en köpt kjol, a bought dress. So here we need to think that although it's T in the end, but for this group we use T also for N word. So this is now a little bit confusing, but that's how it works. Ett läst brev. So for ett word, it's also T. Ett läst brev, a read letter. Lamporna är släckta. The lamps are off switched. För bestämd form, för definite form, den köpta kjolen, the bought dress. Köpta, så det är samma som släckta. Och det lästa brevet, de släckta lamporna. Grupp 3, sy, syr, sydde, sytt till exempel. Och vi har ändelse, we have ending, de, te och da. Dubbede, dubbede, dubbete och da. Till exempel en sydd klänning, a sewed dress, a sewed gown, for example. Klänningen är sydd. Ett sytt skärp. Skärpet är sylt. So a sewed belt. The belt is sewed. Ärmarna är sydda. The arms are sewed. Och bestämd form, den sydda klänningen. Till exempel det sydda skärpet och de sydda ärmarna. Grupp 4 är oregelbundet. So the fourth group are irregular ones. Till exempel stryka, stryker, strök, struckit. Till exempel. Så stryka betyder ironed. You ironed your t-shirt, for example. Och det blir struken, struket och strukna. Så en struken skjorta, an ironed shirt. Skjortorna är struken. Ett struket ord. Ett struket ord means a deleted word or a word you make a stroke on. Så ordet är struket. The word is deleted. Skjortorna är strukna, ironed in plural form. Och definite form, bestämd form, den strukna skjortan. The iron t-shirt, det strukna ordet, the deleted word, de strukna skjortorna. So the plural and definite form shares the same form as the adjective form. Okay, maybe you feel a little bit overwhelmed right now because for understanding this part, in this way, you need to understand how different verb groups works, and you need to understand the conjugations, the rules of declinings of all those verb groups. If you don't like this strategy, I have another advice for you. You can just actually go to the online dictionary Lexing when you're unsure about the verb, how to convert this verb into an adjective, or if it's possible. For example, you can write stäng, stänga. So stäng, to close. Now you see here we have different forms of verb under the word stänga. So att stänga, infinitive form, stängde, past tense, har stängt, supinum, presens perfect. Här har vi, here it begins the perfect particip. Är stängd, is closed, är stängd. So here you can, by this help, you know, okay, now it's stängd, then you change D to T if it's ett word, and stängda is the plural form and also the definite form. So you can also check by learning. But still, in the long run, we need to remember at least the frequently used perfect participes and how they are used as adjectives and how we should conjugate them. So we don't like to check every time we use them. Sometimes you don't really have the chance to check. But when we learn it, this is a possible way. Okay, before we end, I would like to bring up something else which is interesting for Swedish grammar. So we've mentioned earlier, we use adjectives after the word är or blir. Är is or are in English, är in Swedish. Blir means actually become. So in English, you actually don't use the word blir so oftenly with adjectives, but you do use that in Swedish. So you use blir, become, when you are emphasizing on a transaction. For example, you say jag blir sjuk. Eller jag blev sjuk i fredags. So last Friday I became sick. In this case, you are saying I was not sick before Friday, but on Friday it involves a transaction. I became sick. You wouldn't say that in English, you would say I got sick. But in Swedish, you would use the word blir to indicating the transaction. Another example would be jag blir glad när jag ser er. I become happy when I see you. In English, you would say I am happy to see you, or it's joyful to see you, for example. But in Swedish, we are quite detailed in this transition process. We would say jag blir glad när jag ser er. And you would use perfect particip in the same sense. Så till exempel, är plus perfect particip har fokus på ett tillstånd eller resultat. So after är, to use perfect particip or adjectives, you have a focus on the condition or on the result. Till exempel, min cykel är stulen. My bike is stolen. Stolen, yeah. Blir plus perfect particip har fokus på en händelse eller förändring. So after blir, to use perfect particip or adjective has a focus on what's happening and what's being changed, the changing. Till exempel, min cykel blev stulen. So my bike became stolen, and here it involves, you are emphasizing on a transaction. So you are telling your friend what's happened in the past. But here in a previous example, you are just telling the condition of your bike now. Okej, blir plus perfect particip kan oftast bytas ut mot S-passiv också i svenska. So now this is something more advanced, which we will mention a little bit later also when we talk about the passive form of verbs. So what's happening now is actually in English, the passive voice are almost only expressed by participle. For example, you say the letter is written by someone. But in Swedish, we also have the passive form for verb, which means this is a more direct way of expressing passiveness. So here we demonstrate two different possibilities in Swedish. Flera blev förgiftade. Several became poisoned. So flera blev förgiftade. Here we have perfect particip. So we changed the verb into the adjective, poisoned. Men på svenska, in Swedish, you can also say flera förgiftades. Several are poisoned. So it doesn't really it doesn't really shows the structure if you translate it back to English, because we don't have the passive form for the verb directly in English. But I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. We have a passive form for verb in Swedish. So when it's passive but marked by S, we don't need to convert it to a noun anymore, which is essential for English grammar. So in Swedish, you can choose to create an adjective structure or to use the passive form of the verb directly. We will explore this more later, so don't be too confused if you think it's too abstract right now. Now, let's do a test together. The first time I would not say the answer to the questions, but the second time I would review the answers. Så det går inte att komma in. Dörren är. De är av att spela badminton. Mina kläder är redan. Jag är på middag hos min kompis. Huset är nu. Okej, nu kommer facit. Now the answers. Det går inte att komma in. Dörren är stängd. De är intresserade av att spela badminton. Mina kläder är redan tvättade. Jag är bjuden på middag hos min kompis. I am invited. Huset är nu renoverat. Huset renoverat. Okej, tack så jättemycket för idag. Vi ses nästa gång. Hej då!